My stepfather handed me a garbage bag on the day we buried my mother. Not a suitcase. Not a box. A black plastic garbage bag, kind you'd use for yard waste, half filled with whatever he'd swept off my bedroom floor. He held it out at arm's length, the way you'd offer something unclean, and said, "You've got until Sunday." It was Friday afternoon. My mother had been in the ground for 6 hours. I was 23 years old, standing in the front hallway of the house I'd grown up in, the house my mother had owned outright before she met him, and I had absolutely nowhere to go. His name was Patrick. My mother had married him 4 years earlier when I was finishing my last year of high school and too distracted by exams to pay close attention to what was happening in my own home. He was a financial advisor from Oakville, polished in the way that certain men are polished. Smooth answers, expensive watch, the kind of handshake that makes you feel like you've just signed something. My mother called him steady. I called him cautious, which I meant as a compliment at the time. I didn't understand yet what cautious really looked like when the stakes got high. My mother's name was Joanne. She was a landscape architect who had spent 20 years building a small but genuinely respected firm out of Guelph, Ontario. She designed corporate green spaces, hospital courtyards, that kind of thing. Work that looked effortless and wasn't. She was 51 when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and 53 when she died, and in between those two dates, she shrank down from the person who had raised me alone after my father left when I was 7 into someone I barely recognized at the end. Quiet, tired, trusting Patrick to manage everything because she simply didn't have the energy left. That was the part that mattered. She trusted him to manage everything. I found out exactly what that meant 3 weeks after the funeral. The will reading was held at Patrick's lawyer's office in downtown Hamilton. Not my mother's lawyer, not the family lawyer she'd used for 15 years, but Patrick's guy, a man named Dempsey, who had the kind of practiced neutral expression that I now associate with people who are paid to have it. I sat across the table from Patrick and his adult daughter from his first marriage, a woman named Tanya, who I had met exactly twice, and who looked at me the entire time like she was calculating something. My mother's estate was supposed to be straightforward. The house in Guelph, the firm, which had 3 employees and a solid client list, a modest investment account she'd built up over years of careful saving. None of it was enormous. All of it was hers. Dempsey cleared his throat and read from a document dated 8 months before my mother died. During the period, I later learned, when she was on her 2nd round of chemotherapy and barely able to sit up. The house went to Patrick. The investment account went to Patrick. The firm, the thing she had built from nothing, the thing she used to drive me to client sites on weekends so I could see what real work looked like, was to be dissolved, its assets liquidated, proceeds to Patrick. I got a savings bond worth $4,000 and a handwritten note about how much she loved me. I sat very still. I remember the fluorescent light above the table buzzing slightly. I remember thinking that the sound was the only honest thing in the room. "Is this the most recent version?" I asked. Dempsey said it was. I asked if I could see the original. Patrick put his hand flat on the table. "This isn't the time," he said. I looked at him. I thought about my mother on her worst days, barely able to eat, relying on him to drive her to appointments, to fill her prescriptions, to manage her paperwork, because she was in no condition to do it herself. I thought about how much she would have trusted him in those moments, how little capacity she would have had to question anything he put in front of her. I took the $4,000 savings bond and left. I spent the next week in a sleeping bag on my university roommate's couch in Waterloo, applying for jobs I didn't want and trying not to think too hard about what had just happened. I told myself there were explanations. I told myself my mother had made choices I didn't understand. I told myself that grief was making me suspicious of things that were probably fine. Then I found the envelope. It was in a box of things Patrick had apparently thrown into the garbage bag along with my clothes. A box of small objects from my mother's desk that he'd clearly decided weren't worth keeping. Nail scissors, a broken watch, a birthday card I'd made her in grade 4 out of construction paper, and underneath all of that, a small white envelope with my name on it, in her handwriting. Just my name. No return address, no post, like she'd meant to give it to me in person and hadn't managed to. Inside was a single key and a piece of notepaper. The note said, "There is a storage unit. Bruce Peninsula Self-Storage, Lion's Head, Unit 14. The key is for the padlock. I put something there for you. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I waited so long. All my love, Mom." I read it twice. Then I sat on my roommate's couch, for a long time, looking at the key. Lion's Head is about 3 hours north of Waterloo, up through Owen Sound and along the peninsula. I'd been there once as a kid. My mother had taken me camping at Bruce Peninsula National Park the summer I was 12, and I remembered the water being an impossible shade of blue for something in Ontario, more like the Caribbean than anything I associated with the province I'd grown up in. I didn't know why my mother would have a storage unit there. We had no family in the area. She'd never mentioned property or connections to the Bruce Peninsula in any context I could remember. I left the next morning at 5:30. The drive north goes from urban sprawl to open farmland to something genuinely remote faster than you expect. By the time I reached Owen Sound, the highway had narrowed, and the trucks had thinned out, and by the time I turned onto Highway 6 heading toward the peninsula, I was mostly alone on the road. It was late October. The trees on either side had gone to bare branches, and the sky was the flat gray that settles over that part of Ontario from about Thanksgiving until March. I had the heat on full, and the radio finding and losing signals every few minutes as I got deeper into the county. I kept thinking about why she'd waited. She'd had 8 months between diagnosis and the end. 8 months during which she could have called me, could have said, "There's something I need to show you. There's something you need to know about." Why a storage unit in a town 3 hours away? Why the secrecy? Why leave it in an envelope buried under nail scissors and old birthday cards? I didn't have answers. I just kept driving. Bruce Peninsula Self-Storage was exactly what the name suggested. A row of metal-sided units on a gravel lot at the edge of Lion's Head, the kind of facility that has a hand-painted sign and an honor system for after-hours access. Unit 14 was near the far end. The padlock was an older model, heavy, the kind that cost maybe $8 at Canadian Tire. The key fit. Inside was a portable filing cabinet, the plastic kind with a handle, the sort you'd use if you were moving a home office, and sitting on top of it, a small cardboard box sealed with packing tape. That was it. No furniture, no personal belongings, nothing dramatic, just the cabinet and the box. I sat down on the cold concrete floor and opened the cardboard box first. Inside was a digital voice recorder, an old Sony handheld, the kind journalists used to use, and beneath it, a handwritten letter, longer this time, 4 pages on yellow legal pad paper. My mother's handwriting had changed by then, more deliberate, the letters larger than they used to be. The way handwriting sometimes gets when someone is managing pain. I didn't read the letter immediately. I pressed play on the recorder first. Her voice came out of the small speaker, and I hadn't been prepared for that. I hadn't heard her voice since the last day in palliative care when she'd been mostly sedated, and hearing it suddenly, clearly, like she was sitting next to me in that cold concrete unit in Lion's Head. I had to stop the recording and just breathe for a minute. I sat there on the floor with my back against the corrugated metal wall and let the feeling pass, and then I pressed play again. She said, "If you're hearing this, then I didn't get the chance to tell you myself. I'm sorry about that. I kept thinking I'd find the right moment and I ran out of moments." She said, "There are things in that filing cabinet that you need to see, documents. Some of them you'll understand immediately. Some of them you'll need a lawyer for. I'm going to try to explain what I know," she said. Patrick asked me to sign documents I didn't fully understand during my second round of treatment. I was not well. I want to be very clear about that. I was not well, and he knew I was not well, and I believe he chose that time deliberately. She went on for about 12 minutes, clear, methodical, the way she used to explain complicated client situations to me when I was a teenager, stripping out the emotion, laying out the sequence of events. What she described was a pattern, documents brought to her when she was at her lowest, in the weeks following chemotherapy when she could barely hold a pen. Papers explained to her in terms she accepted because she didn't have the capacity to question them. A will that she believed replaced an earlier version, but that she had no memory of being shown in full detail. She said, "I started to understand what might have happened about 3 months before the end. I wasn't strong enough to fight it by then. But I gathered what I could. It's all in the cabinet. Then," she said, very quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. I didn't realize until it was too late what kind of person he was. You deserved better than this situation. You've always deserved better." The recording ended. I sat on that floor for a long time. Then I opened the filing cabinet. My mother had been thorough. Whatever strength she'd had in those final months, she'd used it to document everything she could lay hands on. There were photocopies of the original will, the version she'd had drawn up years before she met Patrick, which left the house and the firm to me outright, with a modest legacy to a land conservation charity she'd supported for years. There were copies of the revised will, the one Dempsey had read from, set side by side, with the dates visible. The timeline was clear. The revised will had been executed on a Thursday in February, 3 days after her worst chemo session of the entire course of treatment, during a period when her own oncologist had documented in writing that she was experiencing significant cognitive impairment as a side effect. There were emails, printed, dated, between Patrick and Dempsey going back nearly a year before the revised will was signed. They were careful, but not careful enough. The language was the kind of language that sounds innocent if you read each sentence in isolation and looks like a map of something much worse when you read the whole thread at once. There were bank records showing transfers. There was a letter from a real estate agent in Hamilton, dated 2 months before my mother died, addressed to Patrick, discussing the anticipated listing of the Guelph property. And there was a second voice recording on the Sony, shorter, only 4 minutes, in which my mother spoke directly to the question of the firm. She had, she explained, spoken with one of her employees, a woman named Harriet, who had been with the firm for 11 years, and Harriet had confirmed that Patrick had contacted her independently, asking about the client list and the existing contracts, the kind of due diligence questions you'd ask if you were planning to sell a business rather than dissolve it. I drove back south that afternoon with the filing cabinet in the trunk and the voice recorder in the cup holder beside me, and for the first time since the funeral, I was not sad. I was something steadier than that, something colder. I did not go to the local police. My mother had anticipated this. Actually, she'd included a note near the bottom of the legal pad letter specifically about it, explaining that she'd spoken to a friend who was a retired Crown prosecutor, and that the appropriate route was directly to a civil litigation lawyer experienced in estate disputes, and ideally a concurrent complaint to the Law Society of Ontario regarding Dempsey's conduct. I called a lawyer in Toronto the following Monday. Her name was Ms. Andrade, a senior partner in an estate litigation firm who had been recommended by my mother's original solicitor. Once I tracked him down through old paperwork my mother had left in the cabinet. Ms. Andrade reviewed the documents over 2 days and called me on Wednesday afternoon. "Your mother was meticulous," she said. "This is a strong file. What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means we proceed on 2 tracks simultaneously. Civil action to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and incapacity, and we file a complaint against Mr. Dempsey. The circumstances around this revised will raise serious questions about how it was prepared and witnessed." She paused. "I'll be direct with you. This will take time. These cases are not quick, but the documentation your mother left you is genuinely exceptional. She knew what she was doing." I know, I thought. She always did. The next several months were not dramatic in the way people imagine legal battles to be. There were no courtrooms with gasping spectators. There were document requests and depositions and a great deal of waiting. Patrick retained his own lawyer, a more expensive one than Dempsey, which told me something about how seriously he was taking this. Tanya, his daughter, sent me a single text message in December that said, "This is very disappointing. and then nothing further. There were moments when it felt impossible. I was working a contract job at an architectural firm in Kitchener. Nothing related to my actual degree, just drafting support work, sleeping in a rented room in someone's basement, spending evenings going through documents with Ms. Andrade on video calls. I was running low on the $4,000 from the savings bond. Ms. Andrade's firm was working on a deferred fee arrangement contingent on the outcome of the case, which was generous, and also a significant reminder of how much rested on whether the evidence was as solid as it looked. It was. The Law Society investigation into Dempsey opened in January. In March, Ms. Andrade received confirmation that the opposing counsel had entered into settlement discussions. I don't know exactly what changed internally on Patrick's side. I've never asked, and I don't particularly want to know. But Ms. Andrade said simply that the email evidence, combined with the medical documentation of my mother's cognitive state at the time of the will signing, had made their position very difficult to maintain. The settlement came in May. I won't go into the specific numbers because they're genuinely not the point. The house in Guelph came back to me. The investment account came back to me. The firm was more complicated. Patrick had already begun the process of liquidating it, and 2 of the 3 employees had moved on. But Harriet was still there, still had the client relationships, and when I sat down with her in my mother's old office, our old office, and told her what had happened and what I wanted to do, she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on anyone's face in a long time. "Your mother talked about you constantly," she said. She would have wanted exactly this. We reopened under a new name, not my mother's name, that felt like something to work toward, something to earn. Just a clean start with the client list she'd spent 20 years building, and Harriet running the day-to-day while I finished an accelerated business certificate at Conestoga College and learned, slowly, what it actually meant to keep something alive. I sold the house in Guelph. I know that sounds like the wrong choice. People have asked me about it. How could I sell it? How could I let it go? But the house was the house that Patrick had lived in for 4 years. The house where he had brought Dempsey to my mother's bedside. The house where he'd handed me a garbage bag on the day of her funeral. The equity from the sale went into the firm, into making it viable, into making it something my mother would recognize. What I kept was the storage unit key. I know that's a small thing. It's a cheap key on a plain ring. Nothing special about it. But when I went back to close out Unit 14 in Bruce Peninsula self-storage, after the settlement was finalized, I stood in that empty concrete space for a few minutes before I left. I thought about my mother making the 3-hour drive north when she was sick. Because she must have driven there herself, there was no other explanation. And gathering everything she could and leaving it there for me. Trusting that I would find it. Trusting that I would know what to do with it. She hadn't been able to protect me in time, but she'd given me everything she could. The key sits on my desk now. It's not decorative. It's just there, next to my laptop and a stack of client folders. I see it every morning when I sit down to start the day. Harriet told me last year that my mother used to say the best landscapes weren't the ones that looked the most finished. They were the ones built to last through difficult seasons, the ones where the root system goes deeper than anyone thinks to look. I think about that a lot. My mother built something that outlasted everything he tried to take, and she made sure, even at the end, that I would be the one standing in it. That's what I carry, not the settlement, not the accounts, not the client list, though I'm grateful for all of it. Just the fact that she thought of me when she had almost nothing left to think with. That she drove 3 hours up a peninsula in October to leave something in a cold storage unit with my name on it. She never stopped being my mother. Not for a single day. And that, in the end, turned out to be worth more than anything Patrick thought he was taking.